I think that really where I'd like to begin the story is thinking back to what engaged me with measurement and therapy in the first place. And originally, I trained as an organizational psychologist. And so I don't know if you know anything about organizational psychology, but it's designing selection mechanisms and jobs and the ergonomics of machinery to make it engaging and make it user-friendly. And I trained in a unit, a research unit that was famous for both clinical psychology training as well as organizational training. And I was as fascinated with the clinical input as I was with the organizational input, so much so that I applied for a job to join Relate in the very, very early days. So this is going back into the sort of early 90s. And my role in Relate was to develop them an evidence base. Now we use the term practice-based evidence. All of the counsellors throughout the organisation were collecting information, collecting data, but as an organisation they really didn't know what to do with it. And there was a lot of antagonism towards why do we have to do this? And so my role was really to help the practitioners, the counsellors of Relate to engage in the data, to understand the meaning of the data and to improve the data, the forms that were used, etc., etc. And rather than it being perhaps a administrative skill that I think that people perceive it, can we do it well, give it out well, actually we miss sight of the fact that receiving filled questionnaires from clients, studying them, reflecting the responses back to clients is really a clinical skill that at the moment I think is probably underappreciated and perhaps, although I wouldn't know, perhaps undertaught in courses. So if we start at the beginning and think, well, why might we use a questionnaire? What can a questionnaire help me as a counsellor to do that I couldn't gain by asking the questions myself? Well, the first thing is maybe by using a questionnaire, if you believe in the value of the individual items as being useful to the client, useful to you, then the first thing you might use a questionnaire for is to be more efficient in collecting information. Because if you take the CORE 34 questionnaire, for example, if the client has filled it in at home before coming to their session, or filled it in the waiting room, or filled it in front of you, as you quickly scan through it and look at it, it can give you an insight into areas that you can explore in greater detail. And perhaps it can show you areas that you don't need to explore, because it's evident that in those particular areas, the client has no problem. So that's the first thing I would say, that it's a good idea to use questionnaires that produce information that you would find useful and for efficient for getting more out of the 50-minute hour. The second thing I think I would say that you'd use a measure for is to perhaps help the client to articulate things that might be difficult to say before getting to know you. So that's another area of efficiency.
I was just going to say that. I was thinking that having looked at the questions, there are some questions, quite sensitive questions.
Yeah.
And I think that, especially if I was given back a questionnaire and I saw some of the outcomes on the questions, then that would indicate that actually this is something that is really meaningful for that person. And it's a way of, I suppose, that person prioritizing what they would like to talk about, even though they might not be able to verbalize that initially. So it is, in some respects, a way that somebody can bring something without having to say it first, which can be very scary for people, I would have thought.
So just hold that thought for a moment. And let's go back to thinking of it as an administrative activity. You've got yourself a job, your first role as a counsellor in an agency, in a service, and as part of your induction, you're told, oh, and in this service, we use this questionnaire. Would you mind giving it out to all of the clients and then hand it in to the reception and we'll take it from there. And so you're perhaps giving quite a lengthy questionnaire over to a client who is filling it out, 34 items, 2 sides, giving it back to you. And because you're perceiving this to be an administrative activity, when you receive it back from the client, you're simply saying, oh, job done, thank you very much indeed. Now, how can I help you? Now, immediately...
Well, I just felt, even when you did that, I thought, well, actually, I've just filled it in. So, yeah, it's dismissive, I think, at best.
We made, with the help of Leeds University last year, we made a film of clients. So we got service users together and we introduced them to the CORE measure. And we essentially asked, if you went to a service and were asked to fill in a questionnaire like this, what would you feel about that? And we then used actors to play the roles of the clients and give the sound bites, really, the headlines, if you like, from the research. And one of the most antagonistic things that they had found in their personal experience was being given a measure and then the therapist not reading or looking at it. And there's a great irony in that. If we think about some of the reasons why practitioners might be uncomfortable, they'll often say, it'll get in the way of the therapeutic alliance. You know, I want to build a relationship first, and somehow this questionnaire is an intrusion. And so often people will report just wanting to get it out of the way. And yet if we speak to clients and we research clients and we ask clients, there's a great irony that perhaps one of the greatest barriers to forming a therapeutic alliance is not actually looking at the responses to a questionnaire that a client's put their heart and soul into. I don't know if you've ever looked at CORE or other questionnaires and answered them for yourselves and just reflected on that experience of what it's like. Where do you go to answer that question? What flashbacks of life experience do you have? And just think of the sensitivity, the sensitive place that a client might be having done that exercise of 34 questions, and then their experience is to give it to you, and then for you to say, okay, thank you very much indeed. Now, how can I help you?
Yeah. When I listen to how you explain that process, I'm thinking if I was a practitioner and I was looking at some scores, I think it is about how you communicate, how you're building that relationship. So it might be that this is the first time that somebody has articulated, not verbally, but in a written or digital format, something quite sensitive.
Absolutely.
And it is a way of introducing that into the session.
Absolutely. But imagine the question, unwanted memories have been disturbing me, you know? And imagine the client going to a place where they've answered that question, perhaps more honestly than they have ever thought to answer anybody, friend, family, otherwise, and has boomeranged them back to a time long, long ago when something very traumatic happened to them that perhaps they've never told anybody. Now, to take you back to that admin experience, they've finally put it down on a piece of paper, they've responded to a piece of paper because they're in the room, and the practitioner, because they're feeling this is an administrative process, has simply said, thank you very much indeed, how can I help? Now that client is now stuck. We have a problem that, you know, the client has disclosed something which sits on that piece of paper and that is perhaps between them but is not addressed.
And actually, when you did that between, I think that's really important, because actually, even if somebody has put something on the paper and they don't feel ready to discuss it, it's something you can highlight, but you don't need, there's no malice in the piece of paper. You don't need to force that onto somebody. It may be, you know, would you like to look at that? And that's, and I think maybe that's the part that some practitioners find difficult, is that once it's there, it's almost, well, I have to investigate that now. And certainly, I suppose if somebody scores really highly on risk, you can check things out, but you would do that normally anyway. So it's about working with the assessment.
And you know, if you've not been encouraged or invited to reflect on how you are going to grow a relationship with this piece of paper, which is an extension of the client, then if you've not had opportunity to reflect or been taught or shown what might constitute good practice, then it may just simply feel really uncomfortable. Because, to be honest, you haven't thought about what to do with it. It's not for you, maybe. Maybe, going back to the scenario that I said before, you're a counsellor, you've come to work in your first job, you're being told, we use this here, well, yeah, fine, yeah, I use that in my training, thank you very much indeed. And so you use it. But you're using it, and perhaps you're not using it in a clinical way. Perhaps you're not respecting the responses, perhaps you're not using the responses, perhaps you are finding it uncomfortable because it sort of puts you on the spot. Here is a deluge of information, and I haven't got time to process that because what I feel that my training has taught me is what I've got to do is build a relationship with you, and that's the most important thing. And we've only got 50 minutes, and actually we've started 5 minutes late for a whole bunch of reasons, etc. And so, you know, that sits perhaps between you as something that may be uncomfortable. And I think that what we really need is to think about how do we incorporate measures into initial sessions, consultations, assessments, whatever you want to call them, as being very much a part of that session.
The assessment is sort of, its foundations is within therapy.
We, as a research team, Chris Evans, Michael Barker, myself, and others that designed the CORE measure, we really can't take credit. We were the facilitators. The people that designed that measure were the practitioners. I'd got up to the part of the story of the design of the measure by saying we went out, we developed a coding, we found a coding frame which we felt pragmatically fit. I took personally the therapist's responses to that questionnaire that said, you know, when you first meet a client, what do you ask? And when you last meet, and I used those domains, subjective well-being, problems, functioning. We added risk as a fourth domain, and we coded all of the responses that that the therapists had made in telling their stories about how they measured outcomes. And the methodology of doing that was to ask, well, what areas do you explore at the beginning of therapy? What areas do you explore at the end of therapy? And so the measure really came out of researching those responses. And as a consequence of that, you know, what I would say is that this is probably one of the few measures, if not maybe the only measure, that was actually developed by practitioners for practitioners. And as a consequence of that, what we have to accept it was launched in 1998. We're in 2018. It's 20 years ago that it was launched. The psychometrics for the measure appeared in the British Journal of Psychiatry in 2001. There has been over, I think, 150 empirical presentations on the the papers, of the CORE measure. And over that period, it is still in its first iteration. There has been no empirical challenges to CORE published in 20 years. It still appears to be as sensitive to measuring change today as we found it to be 20 years ago. And what's even more interesting is that other countries that have followed the methodology, translated CORE by ways of cultural back translations, and published norms, that is, giving it to a population of people that are in the general population, i.e. not a therapy population, and given it to people in therapy across Europe, where the translations have been done, the norms have remained incredibly consistent. And for that, I think that that's given a lot of people a lot of confidence that it is what it set out to be, and that is a thermometer. It is not a diagnosis. It is not an MRI scanner. It will not tell you the detail of what is wrong or why it's wrong, but it will measure a client's temperature, I think, pretty accurately in the majority of cases. What's interesting, of course, is if it doesn't, if the client's scoring low and you're thinking as the therapist, hold on, something's not quite right. Those are the really interesting times.
Yeah.
But as a measure, I think it's done a really good job, it seems. And it is, as I say, the therapist's measure.